So in the last video, we talked about sex, and we made very clear why it is there are only two sexes by definition. And we briefly touched upon what gender is. So in this video, we're really going to get ourselves in trouble, and we're going to talk about gender. So as I explained in the last video, gender is nothing more than an extension of grammar. This is why if I pull either of the two dictionaries off of my bookshelves in the background, you'll find that their definitions for the word gender have nothing at all to do with this idea of what sex you think you are, and nothing to do with this idea of some sort of conglomeration of sex characteristics, or some sort of idea that comes from society about the norms of the sexes, or anything like that. No, it's just an extension of grammar. Every Western language has gender, every single one of them. And in the last video, I used the example of the cat plays with her mouse. There's a reason I used her, and that is because English is a Germanic language. So now we kind of have to have a little bit of a history lesson about English. English originated not from England, but from northwestern Germany. In the later days of the Roman Empire, the Romans occupied Britain. In this case, the native Britons had been forced basically to the fringe and to the highlands, where they spoke, in some way or another, Gaelic languages. The Romans pushed them from the lowlands into the highlands, and these were highly isolated groups. Upon the fall of the Roman Empire, one of the first places that they withdrew from was Britain. What that meant was, in the 5th and 6th centuries AD, that left this wide open plain in the lowlands of England that was pretty much completely devoid of human beings. So these adventurous tribes from northwestern Germany had land that they could go settle on that was free from any sort of invaders, free from any sort of existing human beings with which they might have conflict. Those initial adventurous tribes were known as the Angles and the Saxons. And to put it briefly, they hailed from a region of what we would now call northwestern Germany or extreme southwestern Denmark into extreme northeastern Netherlands along the North Sea. The language that the two tribes spoke was an ancient form of German. Now, they weren't identical languages, and they weren't identical to the language of mainland Germany, if you will, but they were close enough that they could easily communicate using their own tongue. And when they first settled down in the lowlands, if you will, of what we know today as the UK and Great Britain, the language that they spoke at the time was a Germanic language. In isolation, that language evolved differently from the Germanic languages in Germany. What that old language evolved into in the latter half of the first millennia AD was what we now refer to as Old English. Now, that Old English was different from mainland German. However, people who spoke Old English could, at the time, still communicate with mainland Germans in their native tongue, and both parties in that transaction would be able to understand each other well enough to actually be able to get business taken care of, if you will. In 1066, the Normans from France conquered England. And this is where that language changed. Now, to get an idea of what the language looked like in Old English, we're not talking about Shakespeare. We're not talking about Chaucer. We're talking about Beowulf. And that language is a language that no English reader today, without knowing and having trained in Old English, would ever be able to decipher. That language from, say, the latter half of the first millennia AD would be utter gibberish to you and I. And as I mentioned before, in 1066 AD, William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings, and thus ensued the Norman conquest of England. The Normans hailed from modern-day Normandy, and they spoke an ancient French language, closer to Frankish than what was even at the time probably referred to as French. What that means is that they brought their French language with them. Now, in the Old language, in the Old English, they had gendered language for words like the, a, and mine, in the same way that we'd have that in modern German. Die, der, das, ein, eine, mein, meine. Now, in the case of Old English, they also had gendered language in the same way that modern German has gendered language for words like the, a, and mine. Die, der, das. Ein, eine, mein, meine. And of course, case also modifies these words. So in the accusative case and in the dative case and the genitive case, and when we're talking about objects versus direct objects versus subjects, those words would get further modified. And we'll talk about that later in the video. But the point is, in that Old English, the word cat had a gender for it. So when you said the cat, you wouldn't just say the cat. In the same way in modern German, you wouldn't say das Katze, you would only say die Katze. You would never refer to die Katze as der Katze or das Katze in the subjective tense. So in German, you would always say die Katze, just like you would always say der Hund for the dog. And just like in French, you would always say le chien for dog. You would never say la chien. And this is what gender is. But we got to continue on with this history to explain why English has evolved the way it has when it comes to gender, so we can understand what gender is, and in this greater context, how many genders there are. So when the Normans conquered England, some of their words didn't perfectly align with the gender of the already existing words in the what was Germanic language of the time, in Old English. Now, it should probably be said that French was the language of the nobles and of the kings. So when you had the people who were literate, the people who were very well off, they all spoke French. And the people who were peasants all spoke what was at the time Old English, or that Germanic language. Of course, there was some back and forth that happened, and because of that, a lot of the gendering was reduced to the neuter gender. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but there are words that we use today that originate in French for things that are very similar to other words that we use today that originate in Old English or that ancient Germanic language. For example, when we talk about food, the peasants dealt with the animals and they slaughtered the animals. However, the nobility ate the meat. So in this case, when we talk about pigs, pig is an ancient Germanic word, has an ancient Old English origin. Cow has an Old English origin. However, pork has a French origin or a Romance origin. We eat the pork, which comes from the pig. So pork comes from, and I'm gonna butcher the French on this, pork. And I'm gonna butcher this one too, but beef comes from bœuf, which is French. However, cow comes from Kuh, which is German. This period of English is known as Middle English. And we started to see the blending of the French language with the Germanic language in a way that's reflected in the works of, say, Chaucer. Now again, we would still have a really hard time understanding Chaucer, but at least it looks something like English of today. And we might be able to get something out of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in its original Middle English. The point is, this is where the introduction of the Romance languages and the introduction of French started to inform the modern English language. And a huge part of that was as these languages intermingled, the reduction of gender in almost every word to the neuter sense only. And by 1500, the two languages had basically blended to the point where gender had been almost entirely reduced to purely the neuter form. And this is where we see the beginnings of early modern English, 1500 usually being the date that is used to differentiate between Middle English and modern English. And again, that beginning period is known as early modern English, which usually ends around the formation of the United States. It's usually said that early modern English ends right around the latter half of the 18th century, and more recent and high modern English begins. Now, there are still some extremely rare exceptions to this rule, but there are places where things like inanimate objects are ascribed a certain gender, probably more as an element of Old English tradition than actually as a result of some sort of natural evolution of the language. And I'll give you the example that everybody knows. Let's say you buy a boat and you bring your friend to the dock and say, "Ain't she a beaut?" In this case, no one would ever say ain't it a beaut. No one would ever say ain't he a beaut. And this is also a huge part of why boats almost universally get a female name. There is an element of superstition involved in all of that. However, the truth is that when it comes to the English language, we still consider boats conceptually to have the feminine gender when referring to them in, say, the third person. So when we talk about my boat, I say that she's having engine troubles. I say that she's leaking like a sieve. The same thing is somewhat true of motor vehicles and cars, and that's kind of an extension of how boats are referred to because of the development of internal combustion in the late 19th century, which began with the railroad and with boats, and then eventually made its way to cars. Now we have to have a lesson in German, and I'm going to have that lesson by using the sentence we talked about in the last video. The cat plays with her mouse. And the reason I have the word her inserted into the sentence instead of its is because the direct translation to German is Die Katze spielt mit ihren Maus. Okay, so time for a disclaimer. Katze, the German word for cat, and Maus, the German word for mouse, are both feminine, which means the proper suffix when referring to them in the object form is as in seiner Katze and ihrer Maus. I'll fix this in the text. Don't know why I screwed this up, but I did, so bear with me. See you in the comment section. The reason we have die Katze rather than der Katze or das Katze is because there is only one gender for the word Katze, and there are only 3 genders to choose from. In this case, Katze is the subject. So the subject gets the word the modified by the feminine gender and by the subjective case. So in this case, we are always going to refer in the subjective to die Katze, never der Katze, never das Katze. And that word's gender is never going to change no matter what. And this is how gender works. This is the same reason I'm using the word ihren rather than the word, say, seinen Maus, which would mean his mouse, because, again, die Katze is always feminine. We are always referring to her ball, her mouse, her toy, her food. We are never referring to his mouse, his toy, his ball, his food, or its mouse, its ball, its toy, its food. We are always referring to her mouse. And the reason I've modified ihr to ihren is because ihren is the feminine modification of the word ihr, because mouse is feminine. It is always die, and it will never change, no matter what the mouse thinks of itself, no matter what other characteristics the mouse exhibits. There's one exception. When we confer agency, individualistic agency, on a thing in Germanic languages, we then modify the gender to be a direct reflection of the sex of the thing. So in this case, we are never going to confer agency on an inanimate object, or if we do somehow, it doesn't have sex. Therefore, we would be using the neuter case. It would be das Computer in this case. So again, a thing's gender cannot ever change, and we know this is being axiomatically true because of the definition of the word gender and how gender actually works in Germanic languages like English. So let me explain what I mean and how it works by when we confer agency in an individualistic manner to an individual. My brother has a cat. This is actual true. He has 2 cats, but we're going to refer to George. In this case, when I would talk about my brother's cat, I would say seinen Katze. So his cat. And it does not matter that his cat, which is named George, is male. It does not matter. It is always seinen Katze. And when we're talking about the cat playing with her ball or her mouse, it is always mein Bruders Katze spielt mit ihrem Maus. Now, I didn't actually build that sentence correctly because I should be using a genitive case, but I decided to simplify that for the English viewers out there to not make that sentence completely and utterly confusing and totally unintelligible because of how cases work in German. But if we're talking not just about my brother's cat, if we're not just talking about the notion of the cat, if we're conferring agency onto the cat, if we're anthropomorphizing the cat in this case, if we're specifically referring to the individual known as George in German, if we're specifically referring to Georg in a way that confers agency onto the cat, as in the cat is, in this case, George is deciding to play with his mouse instead of with his ball. In this case, we would look to the sex of the cat. In this case, Georg spielt mit seinem Ball. George plays with his ball. Now, since in English, we always refer to human beings as being individuals with agency, that upon whom we are at least conferring that agency. And the same thing is 100% true of all Germanic languages. In the case of human beings, we always confer agency upon them. So when we're talking about my friend Jim, when we're talking about my mother, we are always talking about a specific individual upon whom we've conferred agency. In this case, the only grammatically sound way to refer to them is to refer to their sex. In this case, my mother, who by definition is female, will always get she. In this case, my father, who is by definition male, will always get he. So he talked about how there are only two sexes. So within the greater context of what is grammatically sound and what is actually accurate to refer to human beings, there are only two genders. And Susan, if you're watching, I went through this in pedantic detail as to the context upon which I'm using this reference. I went through utterly ridiculous detail as to why this is the case and why this is, again, never not the case. Grammar is an element and an extension of language, nothing else. And when we're talking about human beings, the grammatically sound way, the only grammatically sound way to refer to them is by their sex. And this is true, again, of all Germanic languages. And it doesn't have to be applied to just human beings. If I said der Katze in the subjective form to a German, they would give me a funny look. If I said das Katze or das Hund, they would give me a funny look because that is not grammatically correct. That is not grammatically, again, correct. So if we're actually going to be grammatically correct, the way we should refer to human beings in the third person, because remember, if I say you, I am ascribing gender to you. In this case, we don't have or your when we talk about the possessive. When I talk about your cat, I'm already ascribing gender to the word your. The gender in this case is neuter. So the only time we would ascribe gender to a human being is in the third person. In this case, if I'm talking to Christopher, my brother, if I say your cat, and I would look to his wife and say his cat, I'm saying the word his because Christopher is always, if we're going to be grammatically sound, always he. The only right way to refer to my brother is as a reference to his sex. Now, I agree. It's not always true that we're going to know perfectly what someone's sex is. But again, the greater question is how many genders are there? And in this context, in the context of this conversation, which is what we are talking about, not any other context, there are only two genders. And Susan, if you're watching, and I hope you're actually watching the whole video, understand that this is actual reality and not just some sort of social norm or something like that. This is how we define these things, and this is not just true. This is axiomatically true. So thanks for sticking with me through all of this, and it's been a roller coaster of a ride. Hopefully Susan doesn't take down this video, though it doesn't actually violate their terms of service or their community guidelines. And again, Thanks for sticking with me, and we will see you in the next one. Good night, folks.